Yes, psychedelic history. Just a little bit of background to make some sort of sense out of what I've got to say. Tends to be framed as the impact of psychedelics on society, and very much starting from the 60s. Here come psychedelics, and this is their impact on society. But my feeling is you have to go much further back than that. I'm not talking really about going back to Greek mysteries, but I'm talking about 19th century and the early 20th century. And I'm attempting here to frame psychedelics within 20th century culture, particularly with reference to transgression. And so I'm sort of saying, here is the impact, as it were, of existing cultural streams on psychedelics and how they were understood. So I hope Rob will forgive me for saying it didn't all happen in the 60s, it didn't all start in the 60s, it goes much further back than that. So, to psychedelics, transgression and the end of history. Biblical quotation, always good to start off with something from the Bible, a bit of wisdom from the Bible. I'm hoping to make 4 key points. Transgression as the essence of modernism. We'll get onto that and my ideas about transgression. Transgression is the modern entry point to the sacred. That's at least to a degree where we get onto someone like Ginsberg. Psychedelics as fundamentally transgressive. Are they? There's this kind of sense that psychedelics are fundamentally subversive in some sense. And is that inherent to their nature or not? I don't necessarily have any answers on that. And then after transgression, what? As Baudrillard said, what are you doing after the orgy? So what happens after you've transgressed to the point where you can't transgress anymore? You're simply exhausted or inspired. But first, psychedelics as transgressive. I must admit the fundamental question very much occupies me, whether the use of these types of drugs, namely of substances that so deeply affect our minds, could not indeed represent a forbidden transgression of limits. Anyone want to tell us who said that? Albert Hofmann, in a letter to Ernst Junger in 1961. So right at the beginning, and in fact before that, Hofmann was concerned. Yep. So an interesting point. Marcus Boone, a very interesting writer on psychedelics. Definitely have a look at his book, The Road of Excess, history of sort of literature and psychedelics. I really recommend that. And his introduction to Walter Benjamin's On Hashish. Walter Benjamin's name's come up at least once before. He's certainly someone who's worth looking at in terms of the history of psychedelics. Yes, hi, Walter Benjamin and Profane Illumination. So, Marcus Boone has this to say: the word drugs and literature in their modern senses both emerged around the same time, about 1800, with the Romantics, and there's been some mention of Coleridge and such like. And both become places filled with an allure that is all the more intense because of the sense of the forbidden, of transgression with which they are invested. So what are acts of transgression? Here's the dictionary definition. I'm not an expert, and the experts on transgression probably pull me apart, but my ideas are, or this is not my ideas, it's the dictionary definition, a violation of a law or a duty or moral principle, and secondly, the action of going beyond or overstepping some boundary or limit. And I think it's number 2 probably that Hofmann is talking about rather than number 1. So acts of transgression can be an act of neglect or omission, but rather tends to assume deliberate intention, to shock, offend or harm another person, but also includes acts that expose oneself to shocking experiences or mental or physical harm, like bungee jumping, for example. Acts of excess, greed, also having an excessively good time, sometimes termed as being transgressive. So I think that one aspect, an important aspect of transgression, is things that somehow damage or violate the integrity of a structure. For example, the mind, the body, society, the state, the natural order of being, however you conceive of that as being, the sacred order of being, if that's a view that you hold, or a thing, for example, a work of art, a religious artifact perhaps. And that includes, in terms of literature and such like, works of art that are disruptive and threaten to overturn the existing standards by which art is measured, or a work of art that depicts or describes an act of transgression, or is something itself damaged. A corrupted text, for example, William Burroughs' approach cut up and such like, or an act of self-mutilation, kind of performance art where people, for example, scar themselves, cut themselves, and such like. So it can be playful. This is the fight between Carnival and Lent, Bruegel, the Lord of Misrule, and such like. I've got it under playful, but things can get out of hand. So, yeah, playful perhaps. Playful could go beyond. Violent, destruction of a religious artifact, for example, and acts of self-mutilation. This is the Shiite memory of the death of Ali, the grandson, I think, of Muhammad. So this is how they remember that. So, moving on, world's first art house tourist. So, I'm sure some people here will know who this is. William Burroughs, 1914, 1997, wrote the Yahé letters, which date back to 53, but were published in 1963. This is one of the City Lights editions. So, he's an icon of 20th century transgression, guns, drugs, queer culture, offering to enlighten you by blowing your brains out. Wrote Junkie. But interestingly, at the end of Junkie, he says, maybe I'll find in Yahé what I was looking for in junk and weed and coke. Yahé may be the final fix. So perhaps quite predictive. Queer, written 51-53, but not published until 1985, and also significantly concerned with his interest in Yahé, and mentions, I think, the interest of the Russian Secret Service and such like. So, transgression as the essence of modernism. So, 20th century modernism can be a bit confusing, issue of the modern and modernity and modernism, but I'm saying modernity is where we're at, yeah? And modernism is characterized as the reaction against modernity, so against Enlightenment rationalism, capitalism, consumer culture, industrialization and mass production, institutionalized religion, materialism, nation states, and was expressed chiefly in art, literature, music and film. Embracing, by way of example, the irrational, Dada and surrealism, natural living, one of the ones that I remembered, Lebensreform, arts and crafts, heterodox gnosis. So from the turn of the century there was an interest in Greek mysteries, alternative Christianities, Gnostic cults and such like. Unseen forces, Society for Psychical Research, and the primitive and the exotic, sometimes taking the form of utopian communities, Anida, for example, in the 19th century, or the farm in the 20th century. Another important influence from the late 19th or 20th century developments emphasised the importance of unseen forces in immaterial realms, electricity, X-rays, quantum physics, atomic theory, Darwinian evolution, in terms of natural sciences, Marxism, politics and psychoanalysis. And all of these tell us that surface appearances are the product of unseen forces that can only be uncovered by and understood by initiates and explained using specialised technical language. Altered states, William James, 1902, so we're talking here just the turn of the century, experimented with a number of different drugs, chloral hydrate, amyl nitrate, nitrous oxide and peyote, and of course wrote the well-known Varieties of Religious Experience. H.G. Wells wrote a number of short stories about psychoactive drugs, which are well worth looking at. The Purple Peleus, if you've not read it, you'll find it online in a PDF, actually about the transformative effect of a psychoactive mushroom, and very indicative of a knowledge of psilocybe-type mushrooms. Because, as far as I'm aware, Armanis muscaria does not give you a kind of transformative experience of the kind that H.G. Wells describes. Under the knife, out of the body experiences, under anaesthesia, the new accelerator, a drug affecting perception of time. So heresy and transgression became a point where individuals could find personal transformation versus conformity, authenticity versus authority, and personal gnosis versus received wisdom, often by deliberate derangement or bypassing of rational processes, a kind of counter-enlightenment, but with an ambiguous relationship with science and technology, which reminds me of Crowley's, our method is science, our aim is religion. So, this I quoted in 2013, the poet makes himself a seer by a long, prodigious and rational disordering of the senses, for he arrives at the unknown, and even if crazed, he ends up by losing the understanding of his visions, at least he has seen them. Rimbaud in 1871 reminds me in particular of Rank Razam's DMT experiences, if you've had the benefit of seeing his DVD. So, better living through chemistry. Psychoactive drugs, are they a rational disordering of the senses? I think in a certain way they are, employing science in a certain sense. Psychedelics versus bankers and corporations, new. Only the comfortable tradesman or financier who amasses millions by systematically cheating his fellows is sane. Excellent. Let me be mad. Mad by all means. Mad with the madness of absinthe, the wildest, most luxurious madness in the world. From Marie Corelli, her novel Wormwood, a drama of Paris in 1890. You might say, Ginsberg, eat your heart out, but it has the same kind of sensibility. So the Heretic Society in 1909, a group of Cambridge intellectuals formed something called a Heretic Society. And speakers, it was a kind of lecture group, lecture sessions, George Bernard Shaw, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Jane Harrison on the classic side, J.B.S. Haldane on the scientific side, and Haldane we'll return to later. He's a very interesting figure and I think little known, but does have connections with psychedelics. So modernism and heresy, so from the early 20th century, psychoactive drug use became part of a Bohemian and avant-garde culture and associated with the Greek and Roman mysteries, for example, Crowley's Eleusinian mysteries, Mysterious East, the occult, parapsychology, chiefly through the medium of art, literature and music and so on, providing direct access to special knowledge of some sort or other, gnosis, and forming a kind of culture of resistance to Enlightenment traditions. Hans Heineuer's Intoxication Art, 1906, this again you can find online, where he discusses the differing qualities of hashish, mescaline, and so on for creative purposes. Stanislaw Witkiewicz, Polish, died in 1939, killed himself rather than fall into the hands of the Russians when they came into Poland. Of course, the Russians at that time were allied to the Nazis. And he did these portraits. These, I think, are self-portraits, the ones I have here. But ciphers indicate under the influence of which drugs he had painted. For example, CO stood for cocaine, ET for ether, EU for eucadal, and so on. I think all of these are self-portraits. If you look for him on Kindle, there's a lovely collection of his artwork in Kindle for, sort of 75p or something of that sort. An interesting figure, again, not well known, but he wrote about his drug experiences quite extensively, and an interesting novel that's sitting on my bookshelf waiting to be read called Insatiability. But I believe it concerns the society becoming fashioned under the influence of pornography and hashish. So psychedelics and modernism, arguably the ideal drug of modernism. disruptive and normal perceptions, providing for deep self-examination or insight, and explains their adoption as a key technology by a developing culture of resistance. Now, transgression is a modern point of entry to the sacred. Chris Jenks' book on transgression. Transgression has become the modern post-God initiative, a searching for limits to break, an eroticism that goes beyond the limits of sexuality. God becomes the overcoming of God. Michael Taussig, whose name has come up, intoxication as an explosively dislocating, reconfiguring mystical force is a dangerous territory, but one we cannot avoid in discussing transgression and modernity at the end of the 20th century, with drugs as much, if not more than sex, occupying a strategic position in politics, revolution, counter-revolution, and the sacred. In his book, actually, Walter Benjamin's grave, so Benjamin coming up yet again. So I think a key figure, in fact, in modernism, and many people wouldn't think of him in this way, is Aleister Crowley. And the other day I Googled Aleister Crowley modernism, and some interesting stuff came in. So if you've not thought of Crowley as a modernist figure, then try Googling that and see what you find. So making the profane sacred, arguably in a sense what happened was that the sacred and the profane merged and the distinctions became unclear. The everyday became mystical and the mystical became everyday. Walter Benjamin's profane illumination of drug-induced perception, or a certain kind of perception that sometimes can be induced through drugs, is of that kind. Wallace Stevens, in his poem Landscape with Boat, wrote, "If nothing was divine, then all things were, the world itself was divine." And this is where my reference to Ginsberg comes in. His poem of 1955, Howl, "The world is holy, the soul is holy, the skin is holy, the nose is holy, the tongue and cock and hand and asshole holy. Everything is holy, everybody is holy, everywhere is holy, every day is in eternity, every man's an angel." And of course, Howl was subject to prosecution for obscenity when it was imported into the US. The DVD, Howl, covers the obscenity trial, which is very interesting. So in the 1960s, psychedelics became a technology of resistance in service of a pre-existing oppositional consciousness or culture of resistance, and became a touchstone of alterity. Hip versus straight really meant, had you turned on? So psychedelics as fundamentally transgressive and subversive, question mark. Back to Hoffman's quote. Hoffman was concerned that psychedelics opened the door to a forbidden transgression of limits. What is Albert so scared of? What is the unspoken fear? A rupture, a tear in the fabric of society, the mind, the soul, the cosmos, through which the other will intrude and take us over? Well, probably all of those things. Junger wrote to Hoffman in 1948. Hoffman actually got in contact with Junger shortly after the war, 1947. So Junger wrote, "It seems indeed you have entered a field that contains so many tempting mysteries. These are experiments in which one sooner or later embarks on truly dangerous paths and may be considered lucky to escape with only a black eye." Well, McKenna tells us that psychedelics are transgressive because they kind of deprogram us to the status quo, to what some people might call the meta-narratives of the elite. So psychedelics is offering an insight into the deeper structures of the mind and society that lead to a distrust of meta-narratives of church, state and other institutions. But my view is, and I think Andy's mentioned this, that these ideologies which are kind of undermined by the kind of insights of psychedelic drugs could be conservative, totalitarian or liberal, and the reaction equally could be conservative, totalitarian or liberal. So I'm saying psychedelics don't necessarily lead to a world of peace, love and understanding. But is he kind of overlooking some things that normally make psychedelics fundamentally transgressive? violation of normative social values, the derangement of the senses as a danger to self. However much we may suggest that psychedelics are largely harmless, harm reduction is a topic which we have here at Breaking Convention. Drug users become isolated from mainstream society, and drug use results in subversion of established values. Well, that's McKenna's theme. Violation of relational rules, a victim is hurt or their safety is disregarded, supplying drugs to others as a danger, and derangement of your own senses, making you a danger to others. And then there's violation of religious laws or moral rules. So sojourning and intercourse with spirits, always taboo and subject to ritual restrictions. But if you think these points are very conservative in nature, licensing will be necessary. You must be trained to operate. You must demonstrate your proficiency to handle consciousness expanding drugs without danger to yourself or the public. So that's Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert in '63. And in terms of religious laws, moral rules, and the taboo aspect, the Kykeon of Eleusis, pain of death on revealing its nature, and then ayahuasca, peyote, and so on, always surrounded by rituals and taboos. Who can use it, when, where, and how? So placing oneself or others at risk of physical or mental harm is a defining aspect, I think, of transgression. In a sense, extreme sports are transgressive, and deep psychonautic adventurism is a kind of extreme sport, arguably, done for the admiration and wonder of the less adventurous. Thanks to Rakrazam for telling us what it's like on the other side, for those of us who don't go there. But deemed irresponsible by some where there may be a personal, social or financial cost. So psychedelics became a tool of 20th century Gnostic enterprise to transcend the ordinary and embrace the extraordinary outside of a formal religious framework, seeking what is, in a sense, a profane illumination, because it recognises, some Breaking Convention, we see that we're forced, in a sense, to recognise and integrate anthropology, sociology of religion, medical science, and the chemistry of psychedelics. We can't simply become primitives again, however much we may wish to do so. So that's my argument why, in a sense, psychedelics do represent a sort of profane illumination and form part, perhaps, of a postmodern spirituality, but I don't go any further with that. So psychedelics in the end of history, plus transgressing transgression, immanentizing the psychedelic eschaton. Apologies to Robert Anton Wilson for borrowing his terminology. If you're not aware what the immanentizing the eschaton is, try Wikipedia, it'll tell you and talk to you a bit about Robert Anton Wilson's use of that and how he borrowed it. Psychedelic apocalypse, bang or whimper. So psychedelics in the end of history. It would appear then that Western consciousness feels itself urged to predicate a sort of finality inherent in its own appearance, and that's Spengler, the historian, writing it in 1918. And I had a few quotes to choose from here, both from Dennis and Terence McKenna. But this is what Terence McKenna had to say. History is going to end. This is the astonishing conclusion I draw from the psychedelic experience. By history, I take McKenna, as with Spengler, to mean an end to our current cultural epoch. And McKenna envisages this as a transcendental departure from business as usual, with psychedelics being the agency of immanentizing a psychedelic apocalypse, in other words, a social, intellectual, spiritual revolution. So McKenna's psychedelic apocalypse, a cataclysmic overturning of the existing order. Opposing that, Professor Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man, he anticipates a global triumph of capitalism, liberal humanism, democracy, and an end of competing ideologies as an infinite extension of the dominant Western culture, with pockets of turmoil that we'll try and keep at bay. So, transgressing transgression, another biblical quote, the salt has lost its savour, with what shall it be salted? So, in a review of Christian's book, Transgression, someone commented, now that the 20th century infatuation with transgression as an end in itself has lost much of its power, Is it time to explore the sources and weigh the consequences of its disturbing appeal? A chap called Mark Deary, in a book called I Must Not Think Bad Thoughts, includes an essay called Been There, Pierced That, etc. And he proposes there that we've become unshockable and that transgression has been commoditized and sold back to us as what Adam Parfrey calls apocalypse culture. So hardcore internet porn, torture porn in the movies, and such like by way of example. So current, or fairly current, extreme culture. There's Burroughs lurking in the shadows, head press, these happen to be books or journals. Esoterra, if you're not aware of that journal, all available through Amazon, and you'll find some of the same writers running through these kinds of journals. Apocalypse culture, I was going to say celebrating, perhaps the wrong word, but serial murder, necrophilia and such like for your entertainment, and eventually we get into something that calls itself aesthetic terrorism. So coming back to Peter Gay, who I talked about at the beginning, and as I lost his slide, seems a long time ago now, he makes this comment about avant-garde masterworks, that they were absorbed into the very canon that their authors professed to despise and had worked to discredit. With time, offensive, or at least startling innovations lost their power to outrage. The absorptive capacity of a cultural establishment that modernists had worked so hard to subvert was nothing less than impressive. I borrowed from an essay by someone who was writing under the name, at least, of Bell Hooks. I've termed this a note on transformative agents. She wasn't talking about psychedelics, but I borrowed it and adapted it slightly. So she has this to say about transformative agents. As agencies, their power to ignite critical consciousness is diffused when they are commodified, and communities of resistance are then replaced by communities of consumption. So what might be psychedelic communities of consumption? I'm suggesting orthodox heresy. That means to say when unorthodox religious processes become institutionalized. Medicalization. I'm not suggesting this is necessarily a bad thing, but when we're looking at nice approved psychedelics for therapeutic purposes. Drug tourism. Can we anticipate soon Thomas Cook offering us our ayahuasca journey? Merchandising. No one got any weapons in the room, I hope. Conferences, one way. Not to be asked back. I hope that Cameron will forgive me for that. So in this scenario, I'm asking, have psychedelics lost their subversive mojo and been absorbed into an existing New Age spiritual supermarket and medical and religious orthodoxy? Coming back to Haldane and the Heretic Society, this was one of his lectures, 1923, I think. Should it ever be generally realised that temperance is a mean, we may expect that mankind will ultimately have at its disposal a vast array of substances like wine, coffee and tobacco, whose intelligent use can add to the amenity of life and promote the expression of man's higher faculties. Now, if you're not aware of it, Haldane was a significant influence on Huxley, and unsurprising when you look at that. And it was Haldane who was he was a Darwinian scientist and a very important one, very important figure. Never won a Nobel Prize, but I think that won Nobel Prize when it did say of Haldane that he was the wisest person he'd ever met. But a question, is he talking about cultural progress, or is he talking about social engineering? So thinking about this conference, I feel there's sort of three large psychedelic domains: medical and scientific uses, sacramental psychedelia, these actually overlap in the proper one, and what I call pure psychedelia, those who love psychedelics just because of what they do. In the medical side, they acquire medical and scientific meaning, but with legal and professional restrictions. On the religious side, they accept it as having religious meaning, not with legal and doctrinal restrictions. I think pure psychedelia belongs largely, coming back in a way to Rob, to the sphere of music, art and literature, retaining the power to subvert. So the bottom two are subject to local discourses of power that says who can do what and when and where and why, but they are all in fact united, I think, by issues of cognitive liberty. So a last word from Haldane. I've tried morphine, heroin and bang and ganja, and Benzedrine. I add because I know that he used it to get through those long nights of writing scientific papers. And he said the alterations of my consciousness due to these drugs were trivial compared with those produced in the course of my work, which is an interesting comment. Anyway, I love these pipe-smoking professors who like doing drugs. There might be one or two amongst us. And a final word from Mr. Burroughs. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Thank you.